I want to tell you a story about Vladimir Putin because this week it's more relevant than ever. In the 1980s, he was positioned in Dresden, and this was during the slow collapse of the Soviet Union. And he wrote extensively about how depressed and miserable he was watching the Russian Empire, the Soviet Empire, slowly crumble. And when he saw the Berlin Wall collapse in real time, he wrote about it as the greatest tragedy of the 20th century, and he basically has a trauma from this. And this is also why he doesn't just want Ukraine, he wants every single piece of land that Russian soldiers set foot on, Soviet soldiers, restored. And he wrote a lot about how the building he was in Dresden, was basically surrounded after the collapse of the Berlin Wall by protesters, by people who wanted Russia and the Soviet Union out of that part of Germany. And he called Moscow for help. And he literally said, and I quote, "I called Moscow and Moscow was silent." And at that moment, Putin realized that the Soviet Union, that the empire he spent so long basing his entire worldview at the center of the universe, was basically collapsing, and it was over. And he never got over it since then. And every day since that moment, he has done everything he can to try and restore what the Russian Empire was and to take it back to its original borders. And that's why Putin's so obsessed with imagery and the idea of a greater Russia. That's why he takes these pathetic and ridiculous photos of him on a horse. But it's also why he's been obsessed with trying to convince the world that Russia is a strong state. Don't poke the Russian bear. And until this week, Putin genuinely thought that it had worked, that he had Trump in his pocket. And it's not just me saying this. If you watch Russian television, Russian state TV that's controlled by the Kremlin, the messaging that they've been putting out is pro-Donald Trump. It's pro-Elon Musk. It's pro-everything that he's been doing to stop shipments of arms to Ukraine and to not put sanctions on Russia. But something changed this week, something fundamental. And that's that Trump realized that Putin isn't going to stop. And when Trump made that promise in 2024 that he would end this war in 2 days, he genuinely meant it. He genuinely thought that he could stop all of this from happening. And that's because he thought that Putin was his friend. If you listen to the interview with Steve Witkoff, he talks about how Trump was moved to tears at the painting that Putin had commissioned of him, because that's how flattery works. That's 101, the KGB. And Trump genuinely looked angry this week. He genuinely looked pissed off after having phone calls with Putin, realizing that actually he doesn't have his back. And it was like listening to someone complain about someone they went to high school with, someone they go back a long way, and genuinely disappointed.
Escalated tensions between the U.S. and Russia after President Trump said he's not happy with President Putin.
To Putin, I said, if you go in to Ukraine, we're going to bomb the in Moscow. I'm telling you, I have no choice. He goes like, I don't believe you. He said, no way, and I said, way.
And it's seismic because the relationships between world leaders, in a lot of ways, is actually more important than world affairs and actual decisions. And I know this sounds positive for Ukraine, but I don't think that Trump is going to drop everything and start arming this country. I don't think he's going to abandon Russia, and I don't think he's going to put sanctions. I think he's going to wash his hands of this. I think he has realized that the war is far more complicated than he imagined it. He realized that Putin isn't going to call in the favors that he asked, and I think he's just going to step back and say, right, I'll leave you guys to it, and he's just going to leave it. And in some ways that's kind of good for this country, because we've been doing a yo-yo game since he took office, since January, of these peace negotiations that Trump constantly keeps going on about, that Putin keeps proposing, and every single time they happen, nothing comes out of it, because these peace negotiations have basically just been a delay tactic so that Putin can continue bombing the shit out of this country without anyone being angry about it, because people think peace is around the corner. So this might be a moment where Ukraine and the rest of Europe says, okay, Trump, the White House, it's off the table. They're no longer relevant, and we're going to deal with this ourselves. So it's a turning point, and it's interesting, and it's a fascinating moment for Ukraine in the summer of 2025. So this is why I sat down with Hamish, and this is what we talked about. So it looks like Trump's relationship with Putin is changing. And what you've written about in The Telegraph is quite fascinating, the sort of psychology that goes on. And my partner reminded me of something the other day. He said, actually, the way that world leaders interact with each other and the way that they think about each other sometimes is more important than the world affairs themselves, the actual policies, that psychology, the way that people think about each other. What do you think Trump actually thinks of Putin right now?
I think you're absolutely right there. Particularly when we're dealing with Trump, who, I say in my piece, he's the most thick-skinned politician on the planet. And he has this sort of it appears to have this sort of childlike naivety that, he changes his mind, virtually more often than the wind changes direction. And I think he believes that he had Putin's measure, and he was actually calling the shots and pushing Putin around. And it just struck me that in the last sort of few days, or probably last week, he suddenly realized that actually it's the other way around. Putin has been playing him. Trump's been saying, we're going to have peace, we're going to negotiate. But Trump suddenly realized that Putin had absolutely no interest in peace at all. And I think that, his expletives, 2 outbursts recently, and the most recent one, when he suddenly says, well, actually, this guy, Putin, he comes across as all nice, but I now realize he's just feeding me bullshit. The rest of us who've been looking at this for the last few years have sort of understood that. And you sort of assume that the president of the United States would too. But I think it is just his character and the way that he does things, and everything is so transactional. It's all about a deal and a business. And I think he assumed that he could just do a deal with Putin. But the big thing I think he's missed out, that doing a real estate deal is very different from doing a deal where lives are at stake. Concrete and bricks are one thing, but actually blood and guts are completely different. And I think that has really sort of hit home to him. And it's all about both men. It's about their legacy. And Putin's legacy is about to disappear, because we've discussed many times, his aim, his initial aim is to subjugate Ukraine. He's a hell of a long way from that. And he knows that if he doesn't achieve his aims, he's finished. He's already lost 1 million casualties. 1 million people have been injured or killed. And his economy and everything else is going south, as we discussed last time. So I think it's a sudden realization that Trump thought that Putin was his mate. He now realizes that he's not. Allied to this, just a final bit on this, Caolan, that we also had yesterday or the day before the leaked audio, allegedly, when Trump called Putin when he wasn't president, but said, if you invade Ukraine, I'll bomb Moscow to shit. And that was his exact words, which, again, it's not very sort of presidential, but, that's the way he said it. And I think that was around his idea that he'd end the war in 24 hours. But absolutely, that's not the case. Trump now knows that he could probably bomb Moscow after the demonstration of superior American air power in the attacks in Iran. I think he understands that he can't do a deal with Putin, not on a real estate, money terms, gold, whatever it is. But actually, the only currency that Putin understands is hard military power. And Trump suddenly realized that he's probably got more than that than Putin has. And that's probably the route to a just ceasefire and peace deal for Ukraine.
It's interesting. I think how much of the relationship between Putin and Trump is down to Putin being a KGB agent as well, right? Some of the classic training that we talk about with flattery, with getting compromat on politicians. How much of a role do you think Putin's psychology with, again, KGB training played in that relationship?
Well, I think you're very astute there. I think a hell of a lot, and a hell of a lot of how Russia works, the KGB or the FSB, which is like the internal, like MI5 in this country, or the FBI maybe in the States. But that is the way. But the FSB, they are thugs. Everything's done through corruption and violence and coercion. That Putin is the master of that. I don't think Putin is the master of military activity, certainly not at the operational and tactical level. But of course, Trump he's the master of real estate. Now, hopefully he's getting a hell of a lot of advice from people who really understand this. And hopefully the head of the CIA is saying, look, Mr. President, this is classic FSB, KGB tactics. They are trying to spin you around and get you to say their lines and their way of thinking. And until about a week ago, we thought that actually that's the case and Putin's been pretty successful. But it suddenly, the penny has dropped with Trump, and hopefully now he can approach it with the knowledge that actually Putin is just a spy who's trying to manipulate Trump for his own means.
What do you think Trump's actually going to do next? Because my opinion of this was that he would just wash his hands of this. He would think this is too complicated. This war is too messy. Putin isn't going along with what I've asked him for. And he doesn't really care about Ukraine. He's probably not going to visit Kyiv like Biden did. And I imagine he's probably just going to wash his hands entirely and say, I want nothing to do with this. Maybe I'll sell a few weapons to Ukraine, but that's it. What do you think he's physically going to do next with this?
I think he might have changed his mind. I absolutely agree. I know if we'd have this conversation 3 weeks ago or maybe a month or so ago, then absolutely that. I think Trump is on a bit of a roll at the moment, and success breeds confidence. I think his operation in Iran was a real demonstration of, quite apart from, I'm not discounting how the Israelis set it up, but the actual mechanism of flying his stealth jets tens of or thousands of miles, bombing with an amazing bomb, pretty much writing down the Iranian nuclear program for some time. That gave him a lot of confidence. And then we've talked before about his not irrational, but his bizarre desire to be the Nobel Peace Prize winner. And I think, what that operation in Iran made, to me, the Middle East safer. And Trump took that as a real bonus. And it goes to the piece where I think he suddenly realized that actually military power has more currency than almost anything else at the moment, particularly if you're dealing with something like Putin. And he also, with this momentum and confidence that he's got, he thought, if I can get some sort of ceasefire that's just enough for the Ukrainians to accept, then bingo, that is my Nobel Peace Prize in the pocket. Actually, I write in the piece, I've been one of Trump's biggest critics, and I still am. But quite frankly, if he gets a just ceasefire for the Ukrainians, then, I'll be the first person clapping him to the pedestal to pick up to have his medal stamped on his chest. So I think so what is he going to do? He says he's going to do a great big speech on Monday or announcement about Ukraine. I don't think he's going to threaten to bomb Moscow, certainly not in this speech, but there seems to be a lot of rumors that there is this bill being put before the American Parliament about tariffs on people who buy oil, 500% tariffs on people who buy oil. Actually, to me, I think that would be hugely significant. I mean, some say he's going to water it down a bit, but actually, if the Indians and the Chinese have to have a 500% tariff if they buy oil, then that talks. And we know that he's in deep discussions with the Chinese at the moment. And we know that they, ultimately they're as much interested in money as Trump is as well. And I think the Indians, rely so much on America for a whole host of things that Narendra Modi, I don't think would try and oppose Trump on that. So if that happens, then, and Putin can't sell his oil, his coffers are going to go dry pretty quickly. And not even Putin can make ammunition and tanks and missiles without hard currency. So to me, that is hopefully what he's going to do. And the other thing about this, it's about psychology. And in warfare, again, I've written about this, psychology is 10-1 the physical. And hitherto, until Trump's changed of mind, psychologically, he's been given all the bonuses to Putin and not to the Ukrainians. And you're in the country yourself. You must, when some of his statements, I presume people's jaws are just dropped. Whereas I sort of get the feeling now that Trump seems to have found the proper mojo that is required, that perhaps maybe psychologically people are feeling a bit more confident in Ukraine, but as important in Moscow, if suddenly people are aware, oh, crikey, Trump said he was going to bomb Moscow, and we sort of think he probably could if he wanted to. We know that our economy's in freefall, our potato harvest has failed, and actually the rank and file, admittedly Putin and the oligarchs probably don't go near a potato, but the rank and file do, and they are poor, and we've talked about casualties. So the psychological balance, I think, is just tipping towards the West now, and if you accept my thesis that it's 10-1 the physical, then hopefully that will precipitate what we all want, which is a just peace for Ukraine.
Say those sanctions kick in and say Russia is strangled economically. How long do you think this could still continue for? I'm trying to build a picture of the size of the Russian economy and the scale of it compared to what they're spending on military and defense. Say they were cut off, say worst case scenario for Putin, he gets massive sanctions on his oil exports. How long would this continue for? And how long would it be until the soldiers on the front line, paid $2,500 a month, start having their payments blocked?
Well, that's a great question. This was, if we were talking about the UK or the US, we'd say pretty quickly, because people just wouldn't put up with that. Soldiers wouldn't fight if they weren't being paid, sort of thing. But we're talking about Russia here, so it's a slightly different story, I expect. I mean, the main thing is to make sure that people in Russia know the real story, not the rubbish that's put out on Russia Today and TASS and all the rest of it, which is where most people get their media from and what they think is the truth. So given all that, it's still going to be a few months or so, but it's turning up the pressure. I think, Putin has had little pressure on him, particularly from Trump up until fairly recently, because Putin just has been playing him. Now that it appears Trump is on the front foot here and turn up the pressure. But yeah, this is going to be months, unfortunately. It's not going to be weeks. But whatever Trump says on next week, as long as it's backed up by demonstrative statements from the European NATO military countries as well. And there's already, out of Macron's visit that we briefly discussed earlier in the week, there is already detailed plans for a French and British air power to police Ukraine if there is a ceasefire. And this is, again, all messaging to the Kremlin. All this work's been done. We're going to be there. And actually, the reaction of the Kremlin to that, was pretty stark. They're saying this is warmongering, et cetera, usual sort of rubbish we get out of the Kremlin. So unfortunately, it's going to be months rather than weeks, but it steps up the pressure. And a bit like Trump now feeling confidence, and confidence does breed success. Once you get people on the back foot, once they think they're losing, as long as you keep the pressure up, then they're a bit like a dam breaking. I think if he does this and we keep up the pressure, the Russian dam could break in a few months' time. And that's probably the best that we can hope for.
How much do you think Russia is actually in a position of weakness? Because I've been getting lots of comments recently saying, well, the minister that was taken out, assassinated essentially a couple of days ago, actually maybe in Russia shows strength, that Putin is willing to take out anybody, no matter how loyal they are to him. Inside Russia, obviously media is still very, very heavily controlled. People are willing to put up with poverty. They're willing to put up with bleak and hard times. They're used to it in the Soviet Union, and they're willing to put up with a lot more. How difficult do you think it actually is in Russia right now in terms of its economy and Putin's standing, taking that into consideration?
Well, absolutely. That's why I'm saying this. If this happened in this country, the country would fold in weeks. Because Russia is very different. Let's not forget they lost 26 million people in the Second World War, and Britain lost 340,000. It's a completely different psychology. People talking to you might say strength if you take out ministers and generals all the time, but actually, what he is getting rid of is experience, and experience in warfare is absolute gold dust. And you just see that on the front line at the moment with the Russians, who are predominantly conscripts, who are just, and because they're inexperienced, because they don't know what to do, they are dying in their thousands still. But Russia is prepared to keep feeding the meat grinder, as it's described. So, I think, I expect if you or I, or particularly, if we were in Russia, we'd think things are pretty bloody shit. But then, we are not Russians and we haven't been used to this sort of thing. When Stalin had his purges in the 30s and got rid of he got rid of virtually all the elite or all the sort of people in the military who understood things. And, even when the Red Army came to fight in 1940, it wasn't very efficient. And you could see that by the casualties that it took. When you sort of look at what the Russian military is today against the US and NATO, it's almost a medieval force against a modern, fighting force. I think things are pretty rubbish in Russia. A lot of it is about messaging. Let's hope that people, in Russia actually can see your channel and all the stuff that you're putting out there, so they realize what is actually happening, not the rubbish that TASS puts out and all their cronies who masquerade as proper journalists in people like, Russia Today, Germany. Thank God Russia Today, UK has been kicked out a long time ago. But, these are the information and propagandists of the Russian state that are trying to dilute all of the stuff that people like you and I are trying to put out there as what is actually happening, rather than imagined from people, in the depths of Russia.
I mean, how important actually is it in a psychological level for Russians to really know what's going on? Because my view has always been that they're going to be indifferent. The only people that have fled Russia, I call them Amazon refugees. They were fine in 2014 when they stole Crimea. They were fine with what the government was doing in 2022. But as soon as they couldn't get McDonald's delivered, as soon as they couldn't get their Amazon packages, that was a step too far. That was unacceptable. That's when they left. And so, when I went to Kursk, when I went to Suja and spoke to Russians in Russia, they were pretty indifferent. I asked them what they thought about Ukraine. The thing they really said was they were annoyed they couldn't get cell phone signal to contact their relatives. They were complaining about their own situation. And it seems like from every background of everyone, lower to upper class in Russia, they're indifferent to the aggressive expansionism of the Russian Empire. And they see it as totally acceptable. So how important is it actually, from a propaganda perspective, for them to actually know what's going on? Because I genuinely think they already know what's happening. I think they're fully aware of it. Telegram spreads very well in Russia, even if it's controlled, and they're fully aware of what they're doing. And I think my view of it is just it doesn't make a difference to tell them the truth. But you're kind of suggesting actually maybe if they realize, you talk about the mothers of Russia in Afghanistan, do you kind of hold a slightly different perspective to that?
Well, no, I agree actually what you're saying, which is why it's so different. Russia is different from the West. The people in the West wouldn't put out with this sort of stuff, but the Russian psyche is different. And, that goes back to the First World War, the Second World War, the Bolsheviks, et cetera, et cetera. That is, they are different from us. They might look like us, but they are very different. They have different aspirations. And you're right, a lot of people do seem to be pretty apathetic by it. The Amazon generation, as you say, and the oligarchs, the oligarchs who can't get to their yachts in the Mediterranean, their ski chalets in Zermatt or Samoritz, they're the ones who are getting really hacked off, but then they're entirely reliant on Putin for their wealth. So they have a sort of vested interest. I think they're all hoping at some stage it'll be over and they can be back to normal and back to their expensive houses in Mayfair, et cetera, et cetera. But, the rank and file, I think their aspirations are very different from us in the West. You talk about them wanting a cell phone signal, but that might be those who can sort of smell and see Europe. The vast majority of Russia in the East, exactly, it is meaningless to them what is happening in their name. And if Putin, the modern day Tsar, is telling them that he's going to rebuild the Soviet Union, which, perhaps some of them still aspire to, then all very good. The fact that, they can only afford, one bag of potatoes rather than two, they're not buying expensive Western goods. They haven't got, flashy cars. I mean, the last time I was in Moscow, Italy, it was sort of probably 10, 15 years ago, the amount of Rolls Royces, Jaguars, and God knows what else was phenomenal. The amount of bling around was phenomenal. But you sort of realize then when you traveled out into the Russian countryside that that was almost a tiny planet in the middle of this vast country and not necessarily reflective of 99% of the population. But at the end of the day, if that 99% of the population are ambivalent, Putin get on and do exactly what he wants, which is what he's doing at the moment, which is why it is so important that Trump and the West focuses on him. Absolutely. People like me trying to get to the Russian people to tell them, actually, it's pretty dark where you are. If you want the sunny uplands, then get rid of this fellow is maybe a bit meaningless. It's actually Putin and the oligarchs and the people who hold power are the ones that need to be influenced. And hopefully Trump has finally realized that's the case.
Super interesting. Okay, well, I'll put a link to your recent article as well in the description of this video so people can check that out. And it's been really great chatting to you again. Again, our last segment went a little crazy. Everyone seemed to really, really like it. So your analysis is always excellent.
Well, thanks very much for having me, Caolan.
So thank you so much for watching this. If you enjoyed it, then please hit subscribe, leave a comment. It really helps the algorithm. I do these updates as often as I can, talking about the political situation, but I also travel across this country and do work on the front lines and try and form an entire picture of what's going on here. So if you're interested in Ukraine and you're interested in this type of analysis, then follow this channel. Thanks.